Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
We're studying this morning in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. We spent a great deal of the class time last week kind of setting up the picture or the image, the rise of the beast, the coming up and the power structure of the nation of Rome, and into the time of Christianity and the preaching and teaching of the gospel. We talked about the warning that the Apostle Paul gives us in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 7 through 12, where he talks about the rise of what many people call the Antichrist, the one who again would show signs and wonders and cause those who did not trust and did not believe in the things of the gospel to go away into perdition, to destruction, that God would allow him to preach and teach lies so that those who had no true love for the gospel, the truth, might be deceived and again be judged because of their lack of love for the gospel and its teachings. And so we're looking at the next beast, as the book of Revelations has. We were looking at and talked about previous to this the persecution of the early church by the Jews, individuals such as Saul of Tarsus, and when that wasn't successful, the devil moves on to a bigger and stronger and far-reaching beast, and that's the Roman Empire. And Roman Empire and Christianity will again struggle with each other for many years to come, hundreds of years, into the 300s before Rome begins to try and make peace with Christianity, but it's kind of peace on their terms. And so even then, Christianity is somewhat twisted. And so as we come into the lesson this morning, we know that there were a great deal of idols. We talked about that in the Roman Empire. We talked about the fact that the people of Greece, their gods, their idols, were incorporated in essence into Roman theology, mythology, whatever you want to call it, just changing the names of some, but basically keeping the same gods. And so the Romans encouraged both the worship of the idols and even much more so that of the emperor, believing and accepting that Caesar was Lord. Now, when Saul of Tarsus, was persecuting the church, he tried to compel the Christians to blaspheme and say things against the name of Christ. And so as the beast comes forth, he has the power of Rome, has the emperor worship, as well as the idols. And we see many of those temples and many of those places today. And the interesting thing was, when we think about that time, in the pagan temples, you would find a statue of the emperor, and the people would worship the emperor as well as they worship Jupiter or one of the other idols. When it came to the temple at Jerusalem, again, rather than sacrificing offerings to Caesar, they had came to a somewhat peaceful resolution, in the sense that rather than offering a sacrifice to Caesar, the Jews would offer a sacrifice for Caesar daily. And so that kind of made some appeasement for a while. But Rome really expected the emperor to be incorporated into the worship of the people, as well as the other gods. And so that kind of brings us to the battle and the situation and the circumstances that we see unfolding in the book of Revelation as things continue. And as we come into verse 15, it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. And we mentioned last week, if you have watched the History Channel and some of those places, you'll kind of see how they tricked some of the worshipers. They would have a priest under the temple, underneath it, or behind the statue, or whatever, and they would cause their voice to bellow out or in the temple or the place of worship, and it sounded as if the statue itself was talking in one of these. And if you've seen some of those, the acoustics were very good. They were pretty much engineered to trick and convince people that, the image of the beast, the image that they were worshiping, whatever that was actually speaking to them. Now, what we have here is the statement that there was going to be a circumstance that came up, that unless one was willing to comply with the beast and go along with the beast, it would be exceptionally hard to buy and sell and trade. And the interesting thing that we see as we compare this to the sealing of the saints. In previous chapters, back in the 7th chapter, we talk about that God held things back until the 144,000 out of the nation of Israel, that they should be sealed. They would receive a mark in their foreheads, that is, their thoughts or their minds would be established in the things of God. And as we come here, talks about those both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, verse 16, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. Now, this is kind of interesting because when they were marking the saints of God, the seal was on their forehead or on their mind. But when it comes to the beast doesn't really care that you absolutely agree with everything that they're doing. And so besides those who, again, would, I mean, if you'll do it, fine, that's wonderful. But then again, the right hand represents one's ability to act and their actions. And so even if you didn't fully agree with the things that Rome was doing, nonetheless, as long as your actions reflected the will of Rome, again, could care less. Rome wasn't, that concerned about which god you worshiped, as long as, again, you paid tribute to Caesar and that you submitted yourself to Rome. And so they had agreements with many different religious groups and organizations and all. So whether or not they fully embraced emperor worship, whether or not they fully embraced their servitude to Rome, Rome didn't really care, just as long as they behaved themselves. They didn't really mind, and they worked out somewhat of a peaceful resolution, even with the Jewish people, showing that, again, as I said, that rather than putting a statue of Caesar in the temple and offering a sacrifice to him, that they would offer a daily sacrifice for him. And so they found a peaceful kind of resolution. They were honoring Caesar with a sacrifice. And as far as the Romans were concerned, that was good. But again, in the course of time, the Jews and the factions that didn't want Roman rule had their uprising that set off the things that we have been studying and talking about. And so the Jewish people weren't interested in having Rome control their thinking process, and they weren't happy with Rome controlling their actions and deeds. They were looking for this Messiah who was going to come and make the Gentiles subject to the Jews. And if anything, they would have the mark of the Jews in their forehead, because the Jews wanted to conquer, and their Messiah would reign and rule from Jerusalem. And so this is the battle that we see. The Jews set this off. They did not want. The rest of the world was pretty much happy to say Caesar is Lord, pay their tributes, have a statue of Caesar in their temples. And so in that sense, they had the influence of the beast, Rome, either in their thought process or in their actions. And so they were subject to Rome. And so they were free to buy, sell, trade, do whatever they wanted to, as long as they paid their tributes and taxes to Caesar, as long as when the publicans said, you owe this much to Caesar, you paid that. Caesar was happy. You could buy, sell, trade. But when Israel rebelled, when any nation rebelled against Rome, the recourse that Rome had was, as we see in AD 70, if they would not submit, if they refused to submit, then the only thing was to come by force and take their place and perhaps their nation away from them. We see that there were these token kings that were somewhat connected with the Jewish people, that they allowed to rule. They allowed the Sanhedrin to have its rule, as long as they, again, made good with Caesar. But they chose not to. And as we said before, even when Titus came into and around and was attempting to ultimately quiet the rebellion of the Jews, Titus gave them an opportunity basically to apologize, acknowledge their shortcomings, and submit to Rome, and all would be well. He would withdraw, go back to his father Vespasian, and tell him that the Jews had surrendered, but they chose to mock Titus, to make fun of the things of Rome. They basically spit in the face of Titus and said, we're not going to let you tell us what we're going to believe or what we're going to do or when we can buy and who we can sell to and all of those things. And so ultimately Titus and his forces came and, as they feared, took away their place and their nation, and they were put under an absolute submission to the Romans. And again, they tried to rebel later on in the earlier part of 100s, 130, 35, somewhere around there. And Rome just finally said, that's it. And so that's why the Holy Land lay desolate for so long, is because the Romans literally at that time came in and they let them come back later, but they tried to rebel again. This time Rome said, we're finished. And so they basically plowed Jerusalem under. That's why today, when you see archaeologists in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem you see today, most of that is not the Jerusalem that was there then. It's been built on top of the old Jerusalem. And I've frequently see, like in archaeology review in places, somebody will be under their house and they'll be digging a basement under their house. And the next thing they know, they dig down and a hole opens up and they look down, and there they've dug into an old house that was there before Rome ultimately plowed the city under. And so the next power that's going to struggle and to fight, both in way of punishing the Jewish people, but also will be in conflict with the people of God, is that of the nation. Now, does anybody have any questions or comments before we get into the biggie? The biggie's the next one, but we're going to get there. But up to this point. Now, this is the picture that we have of all these things going on. Now, the Apostle John says, here is wisdom. Okay, this is a tricky thing. It's like a puzzle. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is, but if you're smart enough, you can figure it out for yourself. Okay, so this is going to be a little tricky. You got to use a little bit of wisdom. Those who want to understand, okay, count the number of the beast. Then to describe the beast, he says, for it is the number of a man. Not a charge card, not a microchip. It's the number of a man. It has to do with a man. And his number, see, the number is his. His number is 600, 666. 666. Now, there is in the Hebrew gematria, which is a practice that the Jews, it's somewhat esoteric. It's sort of into the esoteric kind of stuff. But the concept was taking names and adding the names together and get numbers and try to figure out if it's a good number, bad number, all that kind of stuff. And so they would substitute for a letter, a number. And so we kind of see that when we're dealing with Rome, what is this?
Oh, or V for victory.
Or
During World War II.
5. A V is 5. And so when we're looking at Rome, Rome did the same thing. For numbers, they substituted letters rather than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this is something that we've been struggling with in the Wednesday night class, trying to decipher all those X's and I's and V's and all that goes along with the textbook there, instead of just printing the number. And so in Hebrew, it was the same thing. There were Hebrew numbers or Hebrew letters, which were numbers. And so what the writer says is that it's a little bit of wisdom. It takes a little bit of wisdom. It needs some understanding. And you have to have a little bit of math skills. You have to be able to count. Use a little wisdom, understanding. You have to be able to count. Do some math. So what we're talking about is the total of the numbers of a man. And of course, that would be his name. Now, over the years, I've seen a lot of different things attributed to this. But again, we have to go back to the time, events, circumstances, all that's going on, and see if there is someone whose name, it's a man, it's not a woman. So it's a him, it's a person, it's a man. It's someone who apparently has great power because they have the ability to cause people, both rich and poor, young and old, to be compelled to follow the things of the beast or of the nation, which at this time, as we've seen, was Rome. And so again, if you look back to that time, if you look at the list that we have in 17, in chapter 17, I'll go back there for just a minute. When we're talking about these Roman kings, in 17:10, it says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and another is not yet come. And so as we looked at that list, we started with Julius, then Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius Caesar. That's 5. Those are the 5 which were. And 1 is. That was Nero. And so the one that was is Nero. Nero is ruling and reigning over Rome. So here's some wisdom. Let's take Nero's name and see what we can do with it. And again, Caesar's name, as it would have been sort of spelled out then, was not just Nero, but it was Neron. Neron Kaiser. Caesar's the English version. But in World War II, Hitler thought he was part of the Third Reich and all these things, and they referred to Hitler as Kaiser. He was Caesar. That's what Kaiser meant in Germany when Adolf Hitler was called Kaiser. And some of those people were called Kaiser. It was in reference to Caesars. They thought they were the new rise of the Roman Empire. And so his name is spelled Neronkaisar. Caesar was actually spelled Kaisar if you're substituting that. Now, if you write his name out, the first letter, which we see as Nun, we see it as an N, but in Hebrew it's Nun, has 50. Do what?
Mine's got a road in there, but it's so little I can't
See it? The N, which in the Hebrew letter is nun, that's the Hebrew term, is 50. There aren't any vowels in Hebrew. Vowels are supplied. So Hebrew is all consonants. And so the next letter is the R, which is Rish in Hebrew. Rish is 200. And the O, as we see it, is not actually a vowel, but it's a consonant, and it's Vav, V-A-V. That's 6. And then Nun, again, is 50. And so we have 50, 200, 6, and 50. Who has some wisdom and understanding and math skills and can add that up? What's that add up to? Nobody's taking notes. That's 306. 50 and 200 is 250, 6 is 256, and 50 is 306. Then we have Kaiser with the Kaf, which is a K, is 100. Samek, which is the S, is 60. And then Resh, again, is 200. And so you have 100, you have 60, and you have 200. So that adds up to 360. And so if you add Neron and Kaiser together, you get 666. And he is the one that is. And this is the beast, and it's the number of man. And so the Roman emperor that was in existence at that time was Nero. And Nero, his name adds up to 666. So again, it's not a card, it's a man. It's not a woman, it's a man. It's not a thing, it's a man. And the total of his name is 666. Now, you mentioned, I think, last week that in some of the texts it says 616. Some of the Bible translations show the number of the beast as 616 instead of 666. And the difference between that is whether or not you put the nun at the end of Nero. If you take the nun off for Neron and it's just Nero, you have to deduct 50 points off of the thing. So that takes us back to 616. And so it is apparent that people previously knew we're dealing with Caesar because how they spelled his name and whether or not they included the N in the end of his name, because most people call him Nero and not Neron. And so if you deduct that in, then you can't leave it 666 in here. So they actually changed the number to 616 to make sure it stayed with Caesar. Yes?
One is Greek counting of it. The other is
That's another way of looking at it too. But there's several different ways, but you always end up back at the same place. You always end up back at the same place. And so this, again, it is what it is. It fits the pattern, it fits the mold. So it's rather disappointing to people to find out that 666 has no meaning to us today other than the fact that it has a historical implication, but it has no present day application. Neither the beast nor the mark of the beast has any present day application to us whatsoever, because we're not under threat by the Roman Empire and the Caesars, and we're not subject to anything of theirs. and there is no Caesar in power. Yes.
And later on in the Middle Ages, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
1500s and in the 1600s, they wanted to take the Pope as being the beast.
Yeah.
At
Well,
that time. You wouldn't have him both.
Again, after the Roman Empire ceased to exist, when it was defeated, and then spiritual Rome, the Catholic Church, was still in existence, and in a way was still, again, holding to many of the traditions and customs, not necessarily of Caesar worship, but there was a spiritual Rome, and so many people tried to, as when I was talking about physical Rome, here was Nero Caesar. They tried to make it spiritual Caesar, which was the Pope, yeah. And so there's a lot of people who have, again, sought to make that to be the Pope. But it means what it meant in John's day, not in the 1500s or 1300s. It makes a good poster. As I've said, everybody's scared to death. And a lot of things people are worried about today may very well be worth worrying about, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has anything to do with the beast per se. Now artificial intelligence is coming out. Apparently we can't do human intelligence anymore. We can't graduate intelligent people, so we're engineering artificial intelligence to take their place. People are panicked about what will happen with artificial intelligence. I have not tinkered with it much, but I do know that it's a very powerful thing. Again, it can be used just like the internet, just like everything else. It can be used for good, but it can also be used for other purposes which are, less that are less valuable to society. And so that, like everything else, good and evil. I'm not so sure I want my computer being much smarter than me, but again, so we will always find people who are trying. We have, people today that say, well, the Bible it's just coming true, day by day. We just see it coming true right before our eyes. And, it won't be long before the mark of the beast and all this stuff. There's always going to be some terrible person. Just as you said, with the rise of papal Rome in persecuting the Protestants, persecuting the Jews, persecuting many different situations, having control over it. That was not a good time or a good situation. And we've seen people rise up like Hitler and Stalin and many others, and we see terrible people around today doing terrible things. And we need to understand that terrible people do terrible things, and terrible people are around just like there are good people. And if we let terrible people come to power and have power, they're going to do terrible things. That's just the way it is. Whatever the circumstance or situation, this just so happens to be a terrible person at a terrible time, and it happens to be, again, during the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, during the persecution of Nero. And we need to also understand it was under the persecution of Nero that, from a historical standpoint, both the Apostle Paul and Peter were put to death. Two very powerful figures in the church, and it was Nero that sentenced both of them to death, as well as persecuting many others that were in the church. And so previous to this, we've talked about back in verse 10, John's warning to the Christians, be careful about getting involved in all this stuff, the battle with the Jews and siding up with the Jews against Rome, because God knew that, it's going to be tough enough for Christians the way it is, because Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism, and Rome hated the Jews. And so Christians were brought into that because they were seen just like the Herodians, just like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the whatever else, Essenes and others. Christians were just seen by the Neros as another sect of Judaism, even though Christianity was a different flavor. It could, from a historical standpoint, be seen as a part of the Jews. And so we've talked about, the battle with Rome. We've talked about some of the things that happened. Some of those who were captured by Rome in discussing the Jewish people. At that time, they would have said that the Christians were a part, they were a sect. Because if you look at the back of the end of the book of Acts, when Paul shows up in Rome a few years before his execution, he calls the Jews together and wants to present a defense for himself and Christianity. And the Jewish leaders, when they come, say, we haven't received any letters, we haven't received any communication whatsoever about you, and again, we haven't heard anything about that sect. And what they mean is that group among us, which are Christians, we really haven't, we really don't have a whole lot about that. So Paul reasoned with them, appointed a day, reasoned with them. So even in Paul's day, though the church may have seen itself as separate, the Jews did not necessarily see Christians as separate. And so that's kind of where we're at.
You said God knew. You reckon it's his way of testing the Christianity once,
Well, it was going to be a terrible time. In the course of time, ultimately Judaism is going to go down as Christianity rises. And of course, God's time frame don't work the way ours does. We see the things that were taking place and how terrible they were and how long that it lasted. But when we look at things that Peter says, like to the Lord, 1,000 years are as a day, and a day is as if 1,000 years. And so we see in the early 300s that the Emperor of Rome begins to embrace Christianity, or at least some form thereof, and there begins to be a merger of Rome and Christianity, who at previous times have been at odds with one another, or at least Rome's been at odds with Christianity. But we see that kind of coming together. And so with Emperor Constantine and others, we began to move together. And so we're talking about a period of 250 years, something like that, which to God is not an exceptionally long. It's long as there's a lot of generations of us, but it's not much time for Him.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.